So welcome everybody here and online. Today is the third class in our Bending the Arts series. And today we're going to talk about the racial history of the church. I'm going to talk about early Christianity up through colonial America. And I'm going to look at, in the history, I'm going to look at both racism and slavery, because they're inextricably bound in America. Then Dennis is going to talk about Presbyterian tensions surrounding the Civil War. And then we have a video we hope is going to work for Reverend Barbie, who's going to talk about some Presbyterian history facts. And then we have an honored guest today, Don Wilson, who has over 40 years of experience in Presbyterian denominations, and he's going to share his experience with us today. The first slavery. It existed long before Jesus and long after Jesus. A slave then was someone who could be born into slavery, or his group, his nation was conquered and therefore enslaved. It was not based on race. There were slaves of all different backgrounds. Race, as we have come to know it, was first born in colonial America as a justification of slavery. And it was based on several false premises. One is that race is a biological distinction among humans. It's not really, it's very superficial. And that races could be classified and ranked, and that some were superior in intelligence. Modern science has proved that none of this is true, very superficial differences, but these notions still linger and they've caused a terrible cost to our society. In early Christianity, Paul first said, rather radically, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Jesus Christ. Well, last month, we saw that the Christians didn't really do the male and female equality, and they didn't really do the Jew or Greek and the no longer slave or free either. St. Augustine in the 4th century and his contemporaries felt that slavery was a result of human sin, but allowed by God as a judgment. Gregory of Nyssa, also in the 4th century, was the first recorded voice to speak out against slavery. He took it a step further than his contemporaries and said, if slave and free are equal, enslaving another is immoral in the eyes of God. The Middle Ages were thriving slavery, and there were Caucasians that were sold to Muslims and dark-skinned migrants in Europe that were enslaved by European elite. Christian law actually forbid the enslaving of Christians by other Christians, but other religions, it was fine to enslave them. And even the churches had slaves, but they did require that the work be lighter than the other slaves. In the Middle Ages, Paul's statement that there's no Jew or Greek, like I said, that didn't hold. The Christians continued to hold social and cultural distinctions and to try to subjugate others. In the 10th century, the Norse encountered Native Americans in Greenland, and the idea was that they would get their furs and lumber. In the 12th century, Henry II of England invaded Ireland to civilize barbarian Irish. Really what he wanted to do was bring the Anglo-Norman lords under control. And all this, his invasion was authorized by the Pope, who wanted to bring the Irish church under control. So it was about power. A Pope is said to have probably sparked the first crusade, which were fought over control of the Holy Lands. And the Crusaders were promised forgiveness of sins and glory, and they hoped to gain a lot of wealth. And this went on for a couple hundred years, and it was a template for later colonization by Europeans. In the Middle Ages, Jews and Muslims were considered heretics. And the Pope, the Catholic Church, ordered them to dress in a different way in the 13th century. But later, the Jews were segregated in separate residential areas and later expelled from England altogether. Muslims were considered incarnated evil, and murdering them was fine. That was okay. Sub-Saharan Africans, even though were depicted as torturers of Christ, even though they had been on pilgrimages, the Europeans had been on pilgrimages, and they had seen the very devout African Christians, but they still depicted them as torturers of Christ. They had a different relationship with the Mongols because they were afraid of the Mongols. The Mongols were a very strong power, and they were very advanced societies. Modern colonialism really started with the European Age of Discovery. The Italians controlled the trade routes to the east, and by this time there was a lot of trade and desire for those. And so there were new shipbuilding techniques. So the Europeans, the other nations in Europe, started just finding other routes to the east. And as they did that, they ran across other groups and they started their empire building. And during this time, there were a series of papal bulls collectively called the Doctrine of Discovery. In 1452, this is one of the ones that I see a lot about. Pope Nicholas V directed King Alfonso of Portugal to, this is quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all sacraments and pagans whatsoever, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, to convert them to his or their use and profit. So 40 years later, Columbus claims the New World for Spain. So by the 1500s, European colonization is well underway, and it's been justified by the Pope, both legally in all different ways. It's justified. Protestant Reformation didn't do much to change any of these ideas. Calvin had a negative view of slavery overall, but he approved of the Old Testament tolerance and regulation of it. There's some scholarly debate over Calvin's level of anti-Semitism, not that he had some, but how much it was. Some say he was bad as his contemporaries. Some say he wasn't quite that bad. Martin Luther said that Muslims were servants of the devil. He said that Jewish schools and synagogues should be set on fire, and that Jewish homes should be razed and destroyed. So as the 15th century came to a close, Europeans were coming to the New World and also going to Africa. They were embarked on exploration. They were looking for new goods, metals, resources, wealth. Some were looking for better economic life for their family. Some were fleeing religious persecution in Europe. And some did feel there was a need to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. The settlers brought religious zeal and the biblical idea of covenant, which is a Calvinistic idea. They felt they were the new Israelites and that God had given them this land, that it was theirs. And they brought with them and accepted slavery. So East was becoming crowded, people pushed west. In the 1700s, there was a large influx of Scotch-Irish who had been, they were poor people who had been invited to come over and help settle the frontier. In the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which didn't have a lot of good things to say about Presbyterians, they were talking about the origin myth of America, and that it was a covenant with God, like I said before, and it was Calvinistic and mostly Presbyterian. The American origin myth is that faithful citizens come together of their own free will, support each other and their God, and God in turn ensures their prosperity. The Scotch-Irish, as I said, were invited to settle it, and they were invited because they were fierce fighters. They'd been trained in Ireland, Ulster, and they were fierce. And they were the shock troops in the Western movement. And this lineage, a lot of influential educators and businessmen came from this group. 17 US presidents were from this group. And this quote from the book really struck me. They saw themselves and their descendants see themselves as the true and authentic patriots, the ones who spilled rivers of blood to secure independence and to acquire indigenous land, gaining blood rights to the latter as they left bloody footprints across the continent. And slavery was in all of the colonies in the United States in the early colonial days before it was the United States. But depending on the economics of the region, the slaves had different roles. In the North, there weren't that many slaves in the homes, but they were employed in specialized jobs, such as shipbuilding or carpentry or goldsmith. In the middle states, where there was farming, they were used as farm help in the summer, but it was a shorter growing season. So in the longer winter months, they were used in specialized ways. And they were sometimes, their owners would hire them out to other people who needed the help. But this was the area that had the earliest abolition movement. And mostly first came from the Quakers, who actually they had slaves themselves, and they had struggled with this since 1600. But they finally did take a stand against it. Now, in the southern states, they had labor-intensive crops, tobacco, and then later cotton and rice. Very long growing season, very hard labor, and they used slaves extensively. They started with white indentured servants, but in 1619, the first African slaves arrived, and they shortly switched to African slaves. And the South felt that slavery was absolutely essential to their prosperity, and they were prosperous, and they wanted that to continue. And the churches in the South supported that. There were slave rebellions from time to time, but there was a very large one in 1676. And the thing that was sort of different about this one was that it was indentured white servants and black together that rose up. Well, the rebellion was squashed, but it scared the plantation owners. And they did not like seeing poor white and black people rise up together. That was scary. So they started in Virginia passing laws that would distinguish white from black. They forbid slaves from defending themselves against white people. They forbade interracial marriage. They allowed white servants to own property, but all property was taken from any black slave and it was given away to poor white people. And the whole idea was to encourage poor white people to ally with the rich white people over race and not over class. And that tactic worked then, and it's worked ever since then. And it was also convenient to define black people as slaves, because if they ran away, they couldn't disappear into the society as easily as white people could. So by the late 1700s, slavery was being questioned in the North, but it was being very heavily defended in the South. And as Christians today, we have a hard time figuring out how any Christian could justify slavery. But these are some of the justifications they had, that there were slaves in the Old Testament and God never said anything. And in fact, Ham's son was made a slave to his brothers. And although slavery was all around at the time, Jesus never said anything against it. All told slaves to obey their masters. They were actually doing these people a favor and removing them from devil worship. And since they had this notion, or put forward this notion, that some groups were of lower intelligence, that slavery was God's way to provide for inferior people. And then this one struck me. The church should concentrate on spiritual matters and not political ones. If that sounds familiar, I have heard that in this very church not that long ago. So now we're going to have Dennis is going to share some more current history with us.
Thank you.
Or before the Civil War, not that current, but yeah. Compared to mine, but okay.
Thank you. Who else but Gail could synthesize centuries of slavery in about 15 minutes? This lady has never found a challenge she was not up to being successful in. We should look at history to help us and understand who and where we are today. As Gail just showed us, some of the truth goes untold over time as privilege and power shape the narrative. There is broad agreement, however, that in 1619, in what is now Virginia, an estimated 30 Africans disembarked as slaves. And that serves as a starting point for America's original sin, racism and white supremacy. Of course, both of them are still with us today. Sometimes they are blatantly obvious, but nowadays, many times they are a bit difficult to clearly discern, especially by their white beneficiaries. From this point on in our class, we will look at Presbyterian attitude toward and participation in slavery and racism from sources that I found. We will then turn to a video, which for those of us in the class, I'm told might be just audio. We'll see. Now, she will share how slavery was used by Presbyterian institutions and how certain U.S. presidents who happened to be Presbyterians did not help the racism issue in our country at all. In fact, they made things much worse during their administrations, and how our involvement might have influenced Presbyterian actions and inactions to today. That's Reverend Dr. Barbie. Finally, we'll hear from our own Don Wilson. And Don had as Gail said, more than 40 years experience in the Presbyterian denomination, much of which was spent on social justice. And a good bit of that was racial justice. I'm looking forward to hearing what he says were his experiences, both good and bad, perhaps, in terms of how did our denomination do along a long timeline in combating racism. Did any lasting change happen as a result of his unit's activities? And then your questions and discussion will follow. PCUSA began in 1788 with the General Assembly holding its first meeting the next year. Jumping ahead a bit to 1838, the denomination divided along theological lines due to old school, new school themes. Meanwhile, chattel slavery had become a critical component of American and then United States life, and in all too many lives of Presbyterians. Reverend Francis McKeamy, often regarded as the father of our denomination, was a slaveholder during the same time he helped form our first presbytery in 1706. He was hardly an outlier. Reverend Samuel Davies did much to extend Presbyterianism in Virginia and further south. He is said to have been particularly interested in ministering to slaves, championing their literacy and their spiritual welfare. He also was active in Native American mission work. Davies, however, never questioned the legitimacy of human bondage, and he too was a slaveholder. Some Presbyterians, though, were criticizing slavery by the end of the 18th century. In 1776, Jacob Green asked in a sermon defending America's independence, "Can it be believed that a people contending for liberty should at the same time be promoting and supporting slavery. Also, that this inconsistency was a crying sin in our land. In 1787, after many northern states had adopted laws to free slaves gradually, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia declared that it shared this interest. And in 1818, the General Assembly adopted a bolder resolution saying, "We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another part as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, and utterly inconsistent with the law of God." So far, so good, right? However, the very same General Assembly warned against harsh censures and further insisted that the sizable number of those in bondage render an immediate and universal emancipation inconsistent alike with the safety of the master and the slave. The very same General Assembly called upon all Presbyterians to support the effort for colonizing Africa by free people of color in the United States. Author Dr. William Yu has stated that a majority of Presbyterians were complicit in promoting, supporting, or willfully ignoring the enslavement of other humans during the early part of the 19th century. He has also stated that half of all Presbyterians owned slaves pre-Civil War. Wu's research indicates that Presbyterian abolitionists were deeply unpopular in their day and received scant support from their denomination. By 1830, some Presbyterians called for a more forthright opposition to slavery. Reverend Samuel Cornish co-founded the first Black newspaper in the United States. This short-lived newspaper opposed colonization and condemned slaveholding without equivocation. Anti-slavery activism intensified in the 1830s in the North. The debate over slavery continued on within the Presbyterian Church and society as a whole, becoming even more a North-South issue. Reverend James Thornwell, a slave owner, regularly defended slavery and promoted white supremacy from his pulpit in Columbia, South Carolina. In 1861, the very year the Civil War began, Thornwell told fellow Christians not to feel guilty enslaving other humans. Further, that the Christian scriptures not only fail to condemn, they as distinctly sanction slavery as any other social condition of man. You may already know that 1861 was also a year that the Southern Presbyterian churches split away over the issue of slavery, forming the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America. After the war, this denomination changed its name to the Presbyterian Church in the U.S. As one author stated, if it were for slavery, segregation, and white supremacy, there would have been no such denomination. Perhaps remarkably, this very denomination reunited with the United Presbyterian Church in the USA to form what we know as PC USA. That was in 1983. Now we'll view, or at least hear, the video from Dr. Barbie from her recent dissertation. And following that, Don Wilson will share his experiences regarding his many years within our denomination promoting social justice.
We have to look at the history of the Presbyterian Church and how we got to be the 90% white that we are. In 1861, the church split. The church split because of a disagreement about slavery. A great part of the Presbyterian Church supported slavery and profited from it. and the other half said it was an abomination to God to oppress God's people in this way. In 1861, we had a Presbyterian president, James Buchanan. James Buchanan was a slaveholder. Major documents of the Presbyterian Church, the Westminster Confession, and the Catechisms of 1789, which we still have in our Constitution today, were not called by a religious organization, but the Parliament of England. I stop here and reiterate the fact that many of the decisions made in the Presbyterian Church were not religious at all, but a part of the government and making decisions that had nothing to do with the uplifting of God or the upbuilding of God's kingdom here on earth, but to keep those in power in power. We've seen historic hatred of Native Americans and African Americans between 1829 and 1921. During that time, we had 5 Presbyterian presidents. So what happens when you have the Indian Removal Act of 1830, residential school systems, Indian schools, 1879 and 1900, the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887, the Scott Act of 1888, Bennett Law, 1888, 1889, Jim Crow laws from 1876 to 1965, convict lease system, 1883 to 1910, the Black Codes in 1860s, and Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Without exception, these laws were blatantly either anti-Native American or anti-African American. 5 presidents. Those presidents were Andrew Jackson, James Buchanan, William Henry Harrison. They themselves owned enslaved people. Grover Cleveland, though not an enslaver himself, was racist towards Native Americans. Woodrow Wilson was notoriously anti-Black. Andrew Jackson donated the land, funds, and slave labor to build the Hermitage Church in Tennessee. Our Presbyterian seminaries also profited from the enslavement of God's people. Princeton Seminary states, the seminary's donor base reflected the geographical diversity of the denomination, and Southern enslavers were a source of fundraising in the early years of the school. 15% of the total revenue of the seminary in the pre-Civil War area. Princeton also admits that multiple scholarships are named for enslavers. Union Presbyterian Seminary, where I am an alumna, states that former President Moses Hope, called in 1805, was an enslaver. In 1821, Union called another enslaver, John Rice. What's interesting is Union does not mention that Union Seminary owned slaves, but their historian, Dr. William Sweetser, writes about all of the folks that enslaved people that were on faculty and the school itself in his book. Columbia Theological Seminary reports in their detailed report, A Window into the Breach, that in 1829, the seminary loaned funds to Charles West to build his Northampton plantation, and the proceeds procured from laboring enslaved persons funded the nephew scholarship. There are too many individuals and scholarships on this list at Columbia, but you may see that in their review on their website. Columbia Seminary was built on and profited from an enormous amount of funds gained from the ownership and labor of enslaved Africans. And I have to be honest with you. As an African-American student writing this project for such a foundationally racist institution, it sickens me to my stomach that I or any person of African descent would ever have to pay any amount for a degree from this institution. I've only listed 3 Presbyterian seminaries in this project, but Presbyterian institutions have an established and historical pattern of white supremacy. It doesn't stop there. We take it to our Presbyterian affiliated universities. Davidson College in North Carolina did not admit the first African-American student until 1964. Davidson's first 3 presidents and multiple faculty members were enslavers. Montreat Conference Center, on which I serve on the board, has not admitted any ties to slavery or the detention of Japanese persons, but it is complicit as it relates to the systemic oppression of minoritized people in the PCUSA. There has been some progress made, but certainly not enough for those who have been injured or feel emotionally free to come through the gates at Montreat. I've been deeply involved in Presbyterianism since 2008, and I have witnessed increasing proclamations from the PCUSA leadership vowing the support and racial and gender diversity. But still so very little has been done. There is a clear line to ties of oppression and enslaved people in this country. And it tickles me still yet that when we want to talk about the goodness of the PCUSA, we mention folks like Lucy Laney, an educator in Augusta, Georgia, and Katherine Johnson of NASA as Presbyterians. Now, their greatness didn't have too much to do with them being Presbyterian. They just happened to be Presbyterian, but it's nice to put these things on printed documents. But we have seen some things happen, but I consider them late starts. The Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon was the first ordained Black woman in the PCUSA in 1974. The first white woman was ordained in 1956. Reverend Dr. Lawrence Bottoms was the first Black moderator in that same year, 1974. He was the pastor at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church. Rebecca Reyes was the first Latina ordained in 1979. Elizabeth Kwan, the first Asian in 1979. And Holly Smith Davis, the first Indigenous woman in 1987. Again, in the PCUSA, we like to talk about the great things we are doing. But it wasn't until 2016 was the first Black woman made moderator. In 2018, the first Latina woman. And it wasn't until 2020 that we had an Indigenous woman. The leader of our church, Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, is a Black man, and that was the first in 2016. The Presbyterian Mission Agency has a Black female, not until 2018. And in 2015, the PCUSA affirmed gay marriage. The denomination is over 200 years old. Think about that.
Okay, and now we will have John, or did you want to?
No, that's fine.
John, you'll come up and
It's you.
you're next.
No.
Okay, come on. And then stand right behind you so they can see you.
Well, I'm very happy to be here today, even though I have to apologize that Marianne, who we thought would join me, is in the hospital. She is progressing well, but it's going to take a little time for her to get back to normal. And therefore, I'm not going to speak on her behalf today. Most of the work that she did in regard to race relations was in a period before we were married. And I know better than to speak on behalf of Marianne on that. I had some ambiguity about how to start about this, but I've given you a paper because it is the sort of parenthetical documents of what I'm going to say. One is a statement of the Confession of 1967, and the other is a brief statement of faith of 1983. The Confession of 1967 was adopted in the year that I returned from Taiwan, where I served for 9 years as a missionary there. And it is probably a most historic document that the church has produced in many, many years. You can see one statement that is, I would just like to highlight from it, in which I'm finding it very difficult to read here with the light, but therefore, the church labors for the abolition of all racial discrimination and ministers to those who are injured by it. This document dealt with many, many other issues, and the theme of it was reconciliation. What led up to that was, I'm sorry that with Marianne in the hospital, I didn't have the time to do all the preparation I wanted to do, but I do have one copy here I got off of Google about Eugene Carson Blake. And I'll leave it here. And if somebody can make copies of it, you can share one of the historic events of the Presbyterian Church. On July 4th, in 1963, Eugene Carson Blake, with a number of other clergymen, tried to integrate an amusement park in Baltimore, and they were arrested. That really was national news at the time. But in the following months, in August, Eugene Carson Blake, who was the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church at that time, with Martin Luther King, went to see President Kennedy and announced that they were going to hold the March on Washington. There was a lot of very vigorous opposition to all of that kind of activity, but the leadership was courageous in standing up at that time because of the racial turmoil that was going on in the States. And what happened was then we had the Confession of 1967. So there's that background, the concern of this racial turmoil. When I came back in 1967, I experienced cultural shock. We didn't have a racial issue in Taiwan. We had other issues that I was involved with. But I suddenly was immersed in the whole racial turmoil that was overwhelming the country, racial riots, disruption, Black power, organizations that were seemingly asserting themselves to say that there is a racial problem in this country. And one of the things that occurred that I was involved with, I had just come back. I was, it's a long story. I was declared persona non grata in Taiwan, and I'm not going to tell you why right now. So I was unemployed, and John Coventry Smith, the head of Comar, called me into his office and said, we have something we want you to do. The church had suddenly been the inheritor of funds that had been held by the government, frozen, that were originally used in China, in the People's Republic of China now. They were not going to be used, obviously, because well, you just another voice coming out.
I think Gail corrected it.
And as a result, this money that we inherited and didn't want, John Coventry Smith said, we're not going to put it into our investment funds, we're going to spend it. And so we formed what was called the Crisis in the Nation program. And I was appointed with 2 other national staff people to run it. It meant bringing back 75 very talented personnel from overseas, not just missionaries, but national church leaders, moderators, presidents of different churches that we were working with throughout the world. They were then assigned to go out into presbyteries that were in the urban areas where the racial turmoil was very evident, and there were a lot of programs going on to address this. They spent their daytimes doing that and then came back in the evenings to go into the suburban churches and say, here is what we found. It was a new interpretation, a way of opening the eyes of people through the vehicle of overseas persons. They didn't come to tell what was happening in Africa, what was happening in Asia or whatever, but what was happening in the United States as they saw it with an international perspective. And right after that, since I was still unemployed, that was just a temporary job, I was asked by John Coventry Smith to be the Secretary for Race Relations. He said, that's a half-time job. We'll figure out what the other half is, and that's another story. So this was a time I was over my cultural shock by this time. And one of the first things that happened, I was the youngest staff person in what was then called Comar. That was the overseas mission agency at that time. In 475, what we called the God Box. And the church was gathering in San Antonio for the General Assembly. And I don't know if you remember the name of Charles Foreman. Charles Foreman, a Black minister, had challenged the churches to address racial justice in a way that they use their funds to redress the injustices that racial people were suffering from in this country. He did it in a dramatic and very confrontational and controversial way. I was in Riverside Church the morning that he walked in and took over the chancel. And the minister and the leadership marched out. And he delivered his message there. And the Presbyterian General Assembly at Riverside Church is not a Presbyterian church, by the way. It's interdenominational. And the General Assembly meeting in Antonio was aware of this. Charles Foreman then moved over to the God Box. We were on the 12th floor and occupied our offices with some of his colleagues. And I was among those who stayed there, not to oppose it, but just to see that there was no damage or no interference with the ongoing work of the church that was being conducted at 475. That was a dramatic wake-up call to the Presbyterian Church. What happened? Well, the next year in Chicago, John Coventry Smith, who was the head of Comar, and Kenny Nye, who was the head director of the Board of National Missions, together came on the floor of the General Assembly and proposed, by granting $100,000 from the funds that they controlled in the agencies, to form the self-development of people. You all know of that program. A program that is addressed to racially diverse communities to help them become more independent and self-sustaining. And they also took an action at that General Assembly to instruct the foundation, the United Presbyterian Foundation, which held all the invested funds, which is considerable, to devote a portion of them, 10%, to what was called PEDCO, Presbyterian Economic Development Corporation. This was an effort to provide seed grants to racially diverse communities in order that they could begin to start businesses and get on their feet and, you know, improve their livelihoods. So that became a very controversial program because we also had in the church a very prominent journal called the Presbyterian Layman. And the Presbyterian Layman took out after the PEDCO because when you do that kind of work and you loan money, some of it doesn't work, but a lot of it did. I would estimate that out of $100,000 that was granted in different loans, $200,000 worth of very viable programs were funded. That is, that an additional money came in from other sources. It was a seed money that caused it to grow in its viability. All of these were very controversial at the time. And I was a member as Secretary for Race Relations of what's called the Race Staff. And I guess the most controversial, Dennis wanted to know what there was, things that we opposed in the church and what we supported. I was a member of the staff, of the Secretary of the Race Staff, who recommended to a body which was in the Council on Church and Race and had established a legal defense fund for people that were being arrested and were detained for their efforts on behalf of racial justice. And we recommended that this fund provide $10,000 to the Angela Davis Defense Fund. Well, you can imagine the controversy that caused. General Assembly met and was in an uproar. And as a result, 20 Black leaders of our church, some of them staff leaders, some of them ministers, donated from their own personal amount of sources the $10,000 to return it to the defense fund, or it to. It never got returned, that is, the $10,000 did go to the legal defense fund. And if you check your history, Angela Davis, although accused of being involved with the Black Panthers and all kinds of violent activity, was acquitted of what she had been accused of. So it was, these were very controversial things that happened. And the things that the church did, I am very proud of, even though they were controversial. This time is limited. I don't want to spend my time telling you what I did the rest of my career. Although I was the administrator of the programs that I've just mentioned. And there were other staff that carried them out. But what I wanted to point out in showing you those two documents is then there was the reunion of the church between the Presbyterian Church US and the United Presbyterian Church USA in 1983. I'd say two things. First, going back to the Confession of 1967, when I came from Taiwan and I was immersed with the staff at 475, I discovered that many of the staff felt that the Confession of 1967 didn't go far enough. For them, the term reconciliation was not the word. The word was justice. But we lived with that, and it was a historic document. When we came to the reunion, a brief statement of faith was formulated. And all I want to point out to you is that I've shown you the whole brief statement of faith. There's one little line in there that mentions racial justice. That's all. And it was kind of a mirror of how the church had gone from 1967 to 1983. I happen to be a very ecumenically minded person. The reunion was motivated out of church unity. But for many of us, it was a major change in getting used to bringing two cultures. One, you've heard the history of slavery and everything together. And the church kind of minimized its approach that it had taken so vigorously in the 1960s. And I don't want to say any more than that, except that in 1994 I resigned. It was time to retire in a way. I was 65, but my future partner, Mary Ann Lundy, had just been fired from the church for having organized the reimagining conference. So when I came to this part of the country, the Presbyterian of Santa Fe, they said, I wanted to join it as an honorably retired minister. They said, there were several other people joining. You have about 8 minutes to tell us about your background and history. And I said, I don't need 8 minutes. I said, my history in the church was a parenthesis between 2 women, Angela Davis and Mary Ann Mundy.
Thank you, Don. Yes, that was great. Great. Okay. Any questions for Don? Although we're really almost out of time here, so maybe not.
I'm sorry for taking.
Oh, no, no, it was wonderful. Thank you, Don. Next week, we're going to be looking, we're going to bring this more home here. What can we do about this? What can we do in our own church, in our own community about these things? Happened to hear yesterday at the Presbyterian meeting that there's something about anti-racism policies that they're encouraging. So, yes, brand new. So that's something that we probably need to look at here. We've talked about, Presbyterian Church has talked about repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, which we talked about today. So there's those things, plus there's a lot of other things in terms of just how to be truly diverse, make everyone welcome, and open our hearts and perhaps our wallets to and our time to make this a better world here in Santa Fe in our church. So I guess with that, we will close for today, and people can get to the 9:30 service on time today. So